Hello and welcome to the Hail Mary, the GPP podcast for NFL Week 13. I'm Big Italy 42. He is Josh Shepherdson at BChad50. Talk about some of your favorite GPP plays, and starting off here with Carson Palmer, the guy who, as we know, having a phenomenal season. Also passed for more yards against the Rams than any player has all season long in their first meeting where the Cardinals lost. But due to the fact that you mentioned here, David Johnson going to be a very popular play. That's the Cardinals piece that everyone's getting because it's a cheap piece. And with a lot of value quarterbacks and even top-end guys like Tom Brady in great matchups, Palmer's going to be one of those guys that kind of flies or falls through the cracks, I guess. And he was very low-owned, as you mentioned here in the Thursday contest.
Yeah, and that was the first thing that caught my eye. I suspected that he'd be low-owned anyway, but he's just 3% owned. Everybody's grabbing David Johnson, as you noted, and I understand it. He's a value play. I like him a lot. But the fact is, Johnson hasn't been relied on as a feature back yet, and they signed Kerwin Williams from their practice squad. And if they can't get the run going, that's going to put the onus on Palmer to air it out more. And while I think David Johnson's a capable running back, Bruce Arians was reluctant to give him a full workload earlier in the year. It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest bit to see Carson Palmer throw an extra half dozen passes this game. You get a little extra volume out of a guy who's already playing at an exceptionally high level, and you have to love that. That boosts his upside tremendously.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a nice way to still get yourself a piece of this offense, but ridiculously low ownership.
Yep.
Next up, a guy who's very, very low owned this week. It is a tough matchup, but coming off one of the better 2-week stretches, he's ever had, and that's Russell Wilson facing up against Minnesota. Seattle doesn't have a big team total, but they didn't have a big team total last week either, and they scored 39 points. So, granted, Vikings a much better defense than the Steelers are, but we've got no Jimmy Graham, we've got no Marshawn Lynch. Thomas Rawls has been effective, but Russell Wilson has seen this before. He's had to make plays with his legs. He's had to make plays down the field with this amount of weapons or even less before. And they're still in win now, must-win mode for Seattle to keep pace in the playoff hunt. So Russell Wilson is the guy that I was looking at too. But then you see the low ownership, and he's even more exciting.
Yeah, and everybody loves Cam Newton, and rightfully so. But Russell Wilson's a dual-threat quarterback just like Cam is. And really the only difference between the two this year, or one of the only differences, the only main difference, is that Newton's found the end zone as a runner, and Wilson hasn't this year. Wilson has yet to score a rushing touchdown, but he has scored plenty of rushing touchdowns in the past, so it's not as if he's incapable of scoring rushing touchdowns or they won't use him around the goal line. He just hasn't gotten to the end zone yet, but he's averaging 36.3 yards rushing per game, which is right in line with what Newton's doing, averaging 247.5 passing yards per game, has 18 touchdowns, just 7 interceptions. He really has been basically Cam Newton's equal in terms of yardage, the difference being, again, the touchdowns on the ground. And if Wilson's able to finally break that seal and find the end zone on the ground, you add in his normal average production even, and you're going to get a plenty good fantasy line for his salary and a plenty good fantasy line at his ownership rate. I mean, it's just exceptionally low. It's just 1% in the Thursday contest.
Yeah, and then next up, Devonta Freeman, a guy who has been one of the top scorers all season long, a running back. Sat out last week with a concussion, of course. Tevin Coleman was fine, but we've seen this before. At the beginning of the year, it was supposed to be Tevin Coleman's job. Devontae stole it and ran with it, literally and figuratively. And then even when both guys were healthy, it was still the Devonta Freeman show. And with Matt Ryan's inconsistencies, as bad as he's been recently, Devonta Freeman is going to be a guy that Atlanta relies heavily on once again because, this offense is a mess right now. This whole team's a mess. And when he's not producing, nobody's producing.
Yeah, and he was far lower owned than I expected. Just 6% owned in the FanDuel mini dive. And I assumed just because he's been so good this year, because gamers who don't do research just immediately plug in some of these superstars, he'd get that top-end running back ownership boost and be at least double-digit owned because he's Devonta Freeman. He leads the league in rushing touchdowns. Click and sort, and you see him at the top of most of these lists. So I expected him to be on more teams, and to see that he's only 6% owned and he's game flow proof. He's a guy that whether they're leading and he's salting the lead away running the ball, or they're trailing and he's catching dump off passes to play catch up, he's a guy that's going to get the ball 20 plus times. And working to his advantage is that Tevin Coleman was a non-factor in the passing game. So Coleman, I mean, for all intents and purposes, I mean, he is just a change of pace back. He's not a guy that's going to get steady work and should cut into Devonta Freeman's playing time. So I love Freeman to get 20-plus touches this week. He has a higher ceiling than any other back, and that's not meant as any disrespect to Adrian Peterson, but Peterson doesn't catch as many passes as Freeman. 4.8 receptions and 42 yards receiving per game. That alone should put him on people's radars. That's 9 fantasy points at DraftKings before even accounting for his ability on the ground. So really love Freeman this week. I think his ceiling is very high, even in a tough matchup. And anytime you can get a high ceiling guy like that, it's such a low ownership rate. You got to get a few shares in GPPs just because of the game-changing ability that he has, the fact that he can push you to the top of a GPP.
Yeah, absolutely, which he's done many times this season. Next up, Buck Allen, a guy who a lot of us were disappointed by the number of touches he saw last week, as you mentioned here in the article. But this is a guy that still does have a nice floor, a nice ceiling. And now, for the second week in a row, since the Dolphins now allow the most rushing yards per game, second week in a row he's facing the worst run defense in the NFL. And Miami is just a complete mess. Not that Baltimore is much ahead of them in that regard, but Buck Allen's still one of the few weapons that still remains healthy on this Baltimore offense.
Yeah, and this probably feels like hyperbole, but I think it's more or less a premature statement as I put in the article. But I feel like Buck Allen is essentially a Devonta Freeman light. I mean, he's a guy that does it all. He runs the football. He's a very good pass catcher. And with a guy like that, that's the kind of ceiling you're looking for, is a guy who can put up points as a receiver, put up points as a runner. Was underutilized, which is the biggest knock on Buck Allen. Second biggest knock is that he's basically the only weapon that's healthy in this offense. Kamar Aiken has been pretty good. I'll give him his due, but not a lot of weapons to take the stress away from Allen to open up running lanes. But all he has to do is spring one play. We saw him catch a touchdown pass last week, and I think he's capable of touching the ball 20-plus times. Even though he didn't last week, he fell short of that threshold. And he's got 100-plus yard from scrimmage upside thanks to this soft matchup against the Dolphins. So the fact that he can score points through the air, score them on the ground, and they used him in the red zone, all things that you have to like about Buck Allen. And again, he's another game flow-proof running back, because if they're ahead, you expect him to carry the ball and salt the lead away. If they're behind, he's going to be utilized as a passer. He was the second most targeted player with Matt Schaub starting at quarterback last week.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, at his price now, he's still a nice value, especially DraftKings. Yep. He was still has the price from last week where he was locked in that Monday night game. Odell Beckham Jr. next up, and crazy to think the low ownership that we're seeing here. Obviously, the Darrelle Revis news just broke, literally just now. But as we're looking at it, I mean, he was doubtful the entire week. Really, Revis was never in line to play this week, and either way, I would have expected Beckham to have around a 10% ownership, even with Revis. But now with Revis out, you imagine this number will creep up now that we move into the weekend towards Sunday on the Sunday contest. But it's telling you that some people are fading him. And if there's one player I'm going to own more than any other player this week, it's Odell Beckham Jr. against a Jets defense that, aside from Darrelle Revis, has been a pretty bad secondary.
I immediately assumed that he was going to be owned on 30+% of rosters, because how could he not be? He's going to be lined up. At the time, we assumed without Revis. Now we know for fact without Revis, but there was really no question that Revis was going to miss this game. The fact that it's official obviously is nice, but he wasn't playing in this contest, and yet he was just 11% owned. You could triple that number, and I would still have a ton of shares of Odell Beckham Jr. Now, I see no reason to bump off of him in GPPs, even on a few rosters, because that edge that you normally get from grabbing a guy who's slightly contrarian and has slightly lower ownership rate disappears. I mean, it's not there because there is no high ownership rate for Odell Beckham. And I think maybe you can double that rate, especially at DraftKings where it's a full point per reception and they have the flex. But I still don't see, with his ownership at 11% where it was on Thursday, I can't see it getting over 30%. That's just too large of a jump to project, even with the news of Revis being out, because, as you noted, he was doubtful and was never expected to play this week. So, gotta love him. He's on fire lately. 56 targets, 30 receptions, 481 yards receiving, and 5 touchdowns in his last 4 games. So, he is on a tear. Eli gets him the football. I mean, you can count on one thing from Eli, and that's a lot of passes in OBJ's direction.
Yeah. I mean, this guy sees a ridiculous amount of targets over here. Amari Cooper next up. We've seen what he can do as far as skill set. It's a similar one to Beckham's. I mean, he's one of the more athletic, big receivers in the league, and you see people kind of flock at times to Michael Crabtree because he's cheaper. Not quite the physical specimen that Amari Cooper is, and he's the more well-known commodity, but also doesn't quite have the monster upside that Cooper provides you with. And this is also a Chiefs defense that struggled really badly at the beginning of the season, started to play much better recently, so kind of scaring people off a little bit. And I mean, that ownership you mentioned here to 6% just still seems pretty low for Cooper.
Yeah, I kind of suspected earlier in the week that Cooper might fly under the radar a little bit. We talked about it on the Receiver podcast, the Yak podcast, and I was glad to see that turned out to be the case. He and Crabtree actually had the same ownership percentage at 6%, but the fact is that indicates that Crabtree's gobbling up some of Cooper's ownership. No defense has allowed more fantasy points to receivers at FanDuel or DraftKings this year than the Chiefs, so it's a plus matchup for Amari Cooper. He's had 4 games where he's gone over 100 yards receiving this year, averaging 77.4 yards receiving and 5.3 receptions per game. So you have to figure that those averages, he should exceed those since he's facing a soft defense. Those numbers came against a variety of defenses, everything from bad to average to well above average defenses, and he's certainly not playing anything but the worst defense in football this week. So I'd expect him to exceed those numbers this week and do it at a low ownership percentage at a fair price too. I mean, his price point on both FanDuel and DraftKings is fair, if not maybe slightly underpriced. So I really like Cooper a lot this week.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that. Next up, Doug Baldwin, another guy who's been good over the past few weeks, still seeing a really low ownership. Obviously the monster game last week, but you mentioned 2 of his last 3 weeks he has over 100 yards receiving.
Yep.
And the options are limited, as we mentioned with Russell Wilson now. I mean, last week, 5 touchdown passes, all of them to Baldwin and Curse. No Jimmy Graham, no Marshawn Lynch, really no one else to speak of that's a viable option in this offense. And Russell Wilson's going to make plays. He's going to need to make plays. And, it's like we said, it's a must-win situation for Seattle still. So he's going to need to make plays down the field, and Doug Baldwin's his favorite target.
Yeah, and Doug Baldwin's playing at a level that we really haven't seen from him before. He's been very good. He leads the Seahawks in receptions and receiving yards and touchdowns, and he's caught 4 touchdown passes in his last 3 games. As you noted, gone over 100 yards receiving in 2 of those contests. The Vikings aren't a soft matchup by any stretch. They're above average, maybe right around average if you want to be, depending on what outlet you look to for stats. But it's a good matchup for a guy at his price point, I should say. Gotta love the price, $3,800 on DraftKings, cheap on FanDuel as well. I do think because he is so cheap on DraftKings and because they have that bigger salary range than you see on FanDuel, his ownership probably will be higher there. The flex will also drive that ownership rate up, but I mean, I went into the week expecting him to be on 25% of rosters or more. Even if you quadruple his ownership rate from the FanDuel mini dive on Thursday, you're talking about 12% ownership. That's 12 to 15% ownership. You can live with that, even in GPPs with Baldwin. Great glue guy at $3,800, but I think there's a little bit more ceiling than you typically get at that price point, and a much safer floor than you usually get, because he's a guy who should get at least 8 targets with Jimmy Graham out of this offense, and that's about what he's been averaging over the last 3 games anyway. So really like Baldwin's volume of work, and I really like his price point and the rapport that he's shown with Russell Wilson of late.
Yeah, and speaking of a guy with big upside, like you mentioned, Julius Thomas, especially when a lot of people will be on Delaney Walker on the opposite side of this same game. Thomas last week, big-time game. Finally, the breakout performance we've kind of been waiting for him, as he wasn't healthy early in the year and things like that. But now we see Julius Thomas. A big part of this offense is the Jaguars team that just goes out of their way to not ever run the football, especially in the red zone. Blake Bortles makes terrible decisions. Play calling's awful. There's all the reasons why people should be away from this team. But Julius Thomas, one of the more reliable receivers in this offense. Allen Hurns was dealing with a concussion. Looks like he's questionable. He may end up being able to go, but maybe not 100%. So that might be a couple extra targets that would have been going Hurns' way that now go to Julius Thomas. And, with the two-headed Allen monster on the field and Thomas, you can't key on any one guy with the defense. So Julius Thomas should have plenty of opportunity this week.
Yeah, and Thomas caught a touchdown in his last game with the Titans, which is promising. Was targeted 8 times in that contest. Didn't really turn in a big line. Caught 5 passes, but didn't put up much yardage. But he's coming off of his best game as a member of the Jaguars. And as you noted with Allen Hurns, if he's at less than 100% or if he's ruled out because of the concussion, then that's more targets to come Julius Thomas's way. Really like the way that they air the football out so frequently in Jacksonville. Definitely boosts the value of all of the pass catchers. But I'm liking Thomas in this one. His ownership rate's low, and he's coming off of a big contest. I think he keeps that momentum up and puts up another good contest against a Titans defense that really isn't particularly good at stopping the tight end anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. So definitely a nice contrarian move, especially I love those same game, same position, opposite team kind of contrarian plays. So that one makes a lot of sense. That's going to wrap things up for us here. Find us on Twitter at DF Cafe. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We've got lots of other great content at dailyfantasycafe.com.